the beginning of the 60s, people were respectful. There was a sense of order. Uh, by the end of the 60s, it was often chaotic, with students taking over buildings, ransacking professors' offices. A bomb went off in my building and so forth. And so in that sense, the 60s were almost a schizophrenic decade. But underneath all that chaotic action, there were some important social changes going on, particularly related to race and gender.
Welcome back to Cambridge Forum and a happy new year to everybody. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and we're coming to you live via Zoom. Well, it's 2024 and we're standing at the crest of an uncertain chapter in world affairs. Today, we're going to examine America's place on the global stage with the help of Joseph Nye, who is one of the country's foremost thinkers on American foreign policy. Nye is Professor Emeritus and former Dean of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. For the past 8 decades, we've lived in the American century. That means it was a period during which the US enjoyed unrivaled world power politically, economically, and militarily. Nye was born on the cusp of this new epoch, and he spent a lifetime illuminating our understanding of the changing contours of American power and world affairs. He's written many books on the nature of power and political leadership, and these have earned him a great reputation as one of the most current and influential world scholars. In his latest book, A Life in the American Century, Nye adds his own personal memoir to this period of history. From his early years growing up on a farm in rural New Jersey to his time in the State Department, the Pentagon, and the intelligence community during the Carter and the Clinton administrations. Nye has witnessed American power up close and helped shape policy on key issues such as nuclear proliferation and East Asian security. After 9/11 drew the US into wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Nye remained an astute observer and critic of the Bush, Obama, and Trump presidencies. He continues to bring his fresh and wise insight to evaluating America's role in the New World Order. So welcome, Joe. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Mary, and I'm a longtime fan of Cambridge Forum.
Well, we've got several recordings of you. We're going to post the links, actually. You've written a lot of books. Well, I have to admit, I really enjoyed this because the personal anecdotes and the memories that you bring to this period of history seems to make the whole period come alive to the reader. And you either have a phenomenal memory or you have very good, meticulous note-taking. So let's start at the beginning, where you said, I was born in 1937 when 1 in every 4 Americans was out of work. So can you paint a little picture for us of the environment where you grew up on this farm, where working for pocket money, even as a child, was expected?
Well, it's worth remembering that in the late 1930s and early 40s, the United States was going through an intense period of isolationism. And my little town in rural New Jersey, northwestern New Jersey, which had about 400 or 500 people total population, really wasn't interested in the rest of the world. And to the extent that the rest of the world intruded on them, they wished it would go away. So our life was very much locally focused, and the world was out there. And when Henry Luce made his famous proclamation of the American century in the spring of 1941, it was basically to shake that isolationism. But we weren't shaken until Pearl Harbor at the end of the year.
So where you were raised, it was New Vernon, New Jersey, and I think it was only about 40 miles from New York City.
That's right.
Yet although it was simple and small, you say, quote, everybody knew each other, everyone was white, and almost all were Republicans. One evening, my father warned us that a Democrat was coming to dinner, but not to worry because he was a contractor and they had to be Democrats. So, despite that extreme political partisanship, which surprised me, there was not the intense animosity we have today between people that don't agree with each other. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, we're going through a period of political polarization in the country today, but I think people don't realize that uh, even back in the days of the 40s and 50s, there was a fair degree of partisan polarization. Um, to be a Democrat, where I grew up in rural New Jersey, I mean, it was an outcast. The town was so Republican that I can remember walking home from school with a schoolmate whose parents were obviously very Republican on the day that Roosevelt died, and his comment is, "Thank God the tyrant is dead." It's, it's hard to get polarization much stronger than that. So yeah, we have problems today, but we've had them in the past too.
You say, quote again, beneath the sense of Republican community, there was also severe class and ethnic differences. Small communities have their pluses and minuses. Now, you had a German grandmother at this time, and it was just the start of the Second World War when you were in kindergarten. Did you encounter any problems from the other kids about this?
No, I didn't. There were ethnic differences, but they tended to discriminate against people from Southern and Eastern Europe. And in that sense, it didn't affect me directly. But it was interesting because we often have a picture of rural life that's created by this famous American primitive painter, Edward Hicks. And he paints these various paintings called The Peaceable Kingdom, where the lion and the lamb lie down together. That's not the way life was in New Vernon, New Jersey. And I think that's also the case for many small rural situations. It's great if you're in one of the insiders, but it's hard to break in.
So your father was actually a businessman. He didn't work on the farm. He actually went into work in New York City every day.
He commuted to New York, but he insisted that we kids, when we were in school, obviously, worked on the farm. He believed that doing dirty farm work was part of your learning process, and I actually appreciate that. He was right.
Growing up, you said you weren't particularly academic and you weren't particularly athletic, preferring the outdoors, but you did learn self-discipline and self-reliance. How did you do that?
Well, one didn't have much choice. I had a very warm and loving family. I had three sisters, but I didn't have many friends to play with. You couldn't get together nine players for a softball game because there weren't nine kids your age. And so I spent a good deal of time uh, uh, going into the woods and streams, fishing and hunting and so forth. And that was simply because the organized sports that most kids have in a suburb, for example, just there weren't enough kids for it.
Another thing that's very interesting is you say kids will only learn when they're ready to do so. And my academic goal was just to get by, which seems to speak to quite an independent spirit at a young age. Did this ever cause any clashes between your father and yourself?
Oh,
Uh,
yes, my parents were constantly pushing me to work harder, do better in school. And they even talked to one of my teachers and said, give him some extra homework. And my reaction to getting extra homework was it was punishment. was designed to make me become more of an achiever. I didn't feel like doing the extra homework, so I I actually didn't do it and got punished for it.
So when did your interest in study change? Was it high school or what
Yeah, in
changed?
high school, I went to another school, and there they announced at each semester the class rankings. And I wound up coming in number 2 on the class rankings in the first time they read this out. I thought, oh my gosh, with a little more effort, I might be number 1. So I tried.
Interesting. Um, so before you decided what you were going to do for a career, you got accepted to Princeton, where you were a lonely minnow, you said, in a rather preppy world. So how was that? How was that
Well, I
transition?
was the only Princeton freshman from my school. And if I'd gone to Deerfield or Exeter or St. Paul's or something, I probably would have been a dozen classmates who I would have known coming there. So again, it pushed towards self-reliance. I mean, I made friends with others in the same position, but you didn't have this instant support system that the kids from the larger prep schools had.
And then you spent your summer somewhat unconventionally by laboring in a copper mining camp that was up between British Columbia and Alaska. And you said that that experience was kind of a personal crucible. So what did the hard work teach you?
Well, there's a leadership theorist called Warren Bennis who later taught at the Kennedy School, who said that sometimes people go through personal crucibles, which makes them discover themselves. And when I went to this work in this mining camp, uh, the miners there couldn't have cared less about my pedigree or whether I'd gone to Andover or Exeter or whatever. The question is, could I wrestle a heavy creosoted timber into place underground so that the walls of the mine didn't cave in?
Mhm.
And you realize that from their point of view, all this stuff that had been preoccupying me at Princeton was totally irrelevant. Question is, could you do the job? And so I worked hard and I was able to do the job.
And you still think that that's a very important kind of apprenticeship for people to go through, because in the book you say to take a summer job working with people who labor with their hands is as valuable as any course that my students will take in college.
Absolutely. I tell students today that working away from the university context, not just a summer internship, but working with people who are working with their hands, doing different types of job, is a great way to learn and make you appreciate what you have and what you don't have. And I found that experience really was worth a college course.
I totally agree with that. You also hitchhiked cross country, I guess at a time when it was much safer to do so. And at the time, you were being exposed to a lot of new philosophical thinking, you said, at college, but you're also very aware that there were no women and no African Americans in your class.
Yes, it's quite amazing if you think about how things have changed in the 50s at Princeton, but also at other Ivy League schools. It was very segregated, not legally, but de facto. And there were no women at a place like Princeton. Years later, when I had a chance to meet Michelle Obama, who had graduated from Princeton, I told her how important I thought her speech at the Democratic Convention was because it told at least one elderly white person how important the changes were that she'd helped to bring about.
Good that you had the chance to do that. So you avoided the Marines and going to Vietnam by being awarded a Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford. And again, you were aware there was no diversity in that group of Americans who'd won, either in race or gender. And apart from the lousy weather in England, you were assigned a servant at Oxford, and you said it taught you the difference between a capital intensive and a labor intensive classroom economy.
Yes, at Oxford in those days, no longer the case. You had a servant that they called a scout who would come and bring you a pint of milk and then would clean your room and took care of you. And I remembered that when I was at Princeton, if I wanted milk, I had to go to the store myself and I had to clean my room myself. So in that sense, it was very different. But what was also different was that I had a refrigerator in my room to keep my milk from spoiling. It was in Oxford, I had to have a new pint of milk every day because otherwise it might spoil. And that's the difference between a labor intensive and a capital intensive economy.
Very interesting. You were studying PPE at Oxford, which is politics, philosophy, and economics, which is the normal route that future politicians in the UK take before they go into government. And you said the Brits sent their best students into government and the US sent them into business. What is your opinion of that different use of intellectual acumen? And was it just then?
Well, that was a phrase that was passed to me by my politics tutor, Lord Crowther Hunt, Norman Hunt, as he then was, later joined the Harold Wilson government. And there was something in it, particularly in those days, that if the sources of upward mobility or a career in the US tended to be in business and not so much in government. In Britain, if you got a first at Oxford or were doing very well, you wanted to join the civil service and or you wanted to run for office and get into parliament. Um, Now there's some overlap between the British and the American systems, but I think it comes out in the sense that the American economy was much more dynamic than the British economy. And I would say the British service was more effective than the American civil service.
Interesting. So now you find yourself at Oxford, and because you're at Oxford, you're able to travel and you get to go behind the Iron Curtain in 1959 at a time when very few Westerners were venturing there. This seems to sense that you valued even early on the importance of meeting people that were not like yourself. And you actually said one discovers what it means to be American by meeting and understanding non-Americans. So this was an interesting lesson, was it not for you?
Well,
Going to
it was, and one of the differences between Oxford or British university terms than American is there's much longer vacation periods, and those vacations can be used for travel. So I used them indeed to travel as much as I could. And going into the Soviet Union in 1959 was a little bit like being a person from Mars dropped into these Soviet cities where they'd never seen an American or a Westerner. And we had a little British Sunbeam Rapier car, and it might as well have been a moonlander. And we'd be surrounded by groups of 20 or 30 or 40 young Russians who would ask questions like, why do you have us surrounded with hostile missiles? And, or, do you believe in God? And so you got this extraordinary range of opinions and curiosity. At that time, there was a great fear of the Soviet Union, and indeed, the Khrushchev was promoting the idea that Russia was going to pass the U.S. In his words, will bury you. After seeing how primitive some of the Russian hotels were, and how limited the menus were. If you went to a restaurant, you realized that the Russians weren't 10 feet tall.
So after you left Oxford, you didn't have a kind of clear career plan in your horizon, and you knew you didn't want to join your father's business. So you went to Harvard to get your doctorate. And one of your examiners that you said was rather gruff was Henry Kissinger. So how did you win over his approval of you?
Well, Henry was not the kind of warm and cuddly professor that you find in novels. He was very interested in Henry and his political power, and so he paid attention to you if you were useful. He decided I could be useful, and he asked me to come down and consult with Nelson Rockefeller, Henry was then advising before he became Nixon's advisor. And then when Henry switched over Nixon, we parted ways for a bit. But afterwards, when I went into the State Department in the Carter administration, he became very friendly and decided that I was going to be of some use and some value. And over the years, we kept what I would call a not a warm relationship, but a respectful relationship. Even though I often disagreed with his policies, I wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs when he died, doing a basic assessment of the morality of his actions, and it said it was a balancing act of the things he got right and got wrong. But he would often send me personal notes when I'd write a column saying, I thought you got it right that time, and signed it himself. So it was a strange relationship, not warm and fuzzy, but respectful.
So a whole chapter in the book is devoted really to the 60s. And you wrote, the long 1960s were a turbulent decade, which many regard as a turning point in modern American history. Well, of course, a lot happened, we know, in the 60s. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the good and the bad. We had, a lot of crises with Vietnam and Cuban Missile Crisis, but we also had some very progressive things occurring. So
Yeah, the 60s are a fascinating decade. My colleague Bob Putnam said there's more difference between the beginning and the end of the 60s than between the 50s and the 60s, or the 60s and the 70s. It's almost like a swimmer who comes to the end of the pool and then does a flip turn. The beginning of the 60s, people were respectful. There was a sense of order. By the end of the 60s, it was often chaotic, with students taking over buildings, ransacking professors' offices. A bomb went off in my building and so forth. And so in that sense, the 60s were almost a schizophrenic decade. But underneath all that chaotic action, there were some important social changes going on, particularly related to race and gender. And so if you look at the civil rights movement, of the women's liberation movement, those were very positive forces that were going on, even when the policy differences over Vietnam and so forth were creating a great deal of chaos and turmoil. So a very schizophrenic decade.
you mentioned that you said the Vietnam imbroglio undercut the soft power of the American century overseas, but it tore society apart at home. Did you have to change any of your professional, personal relationships? Were they affected, any of them, by the Vietnam experience, and whether you supported the war or you didn't support the war?
Well, like many Americans, I initially gave the Kennedy and Johnson administration the benefit of the doubt, and thought that people like McNamara and Bundy and Sorensen and so forth knew what they were doing. By 1967, I had decided that was wrong, and they were doing enormous damage to the country, and that began to break a number of friendships apart. I mean, um, Henry Kissinger and Stanley Hoffman, who were colleagues, both Jewish emigres from Europe, had a very close friendship at the beginning of the 60s, and essentially then at the end of the 60s, after Vietnam, they didn't speak to each other. So there were some sharp divisions. I was interested that some of my friends who went into the military after Oxford and went on later to become generals, but then were still second lieutenants or first lieutenants, and we had less disagreement than they saw that things were not going well in Vietnam, and they were not defending it, even though they served there. Uh, they didn't have the sort of fervor that some of their older or senior officers did.
Hmm. You said America's done a lot of foolish things, or some foolish things. You said Vietnam and the Iraq wars in particular. And there's no reason as a realist not to think that we could do stupid things again. So right now, if you're looking at the situation that we find ourselves in, which is extremely complicated, what do you think is the stupidest thing for the US to do in foreign policy right now?
Well, there's a long list, but one, the immediate, is to desert Ukraine. I think to leave Ukraine in the lurch while Putin advances his imperial designs would do great damage to us, to the security of Europe, and that in turn to world stability. The other that I put on my list would be to change the one China policy, which would get us into an imbroglio with China over Taiwan. Remember, ever since Nixon and Mao couldn't agree on the status of Taiwan, they basically came to agreement that there was one China and that it would be interpreted differently by people on both sides of the Straits of Taiwan. So that meant the Americans would oppose a formal declaration of independence for Taiwan, but would tell the Chinese that they couldn't use force to change it. The Chinese are complaining that the US is eroding that policy by high-level visits and so forth. And I think that would be a mistake because this diplomatic formula has prevented conflict for over 50 years. And I think I can understand with political pressures at home, temptations to erode it further, but I think that would be a mistake as well.
Somebody's written a question in here, Joseph, about this, somewhat connected. Do you have any thoughts on the Caribbean? The reason I ask is because of the citizenship by investment. Many from China and other countries are becoming citizens of these countries through this program. Any thoughts on China possibly taking over an island?
Well, I don't think they're going to take over an island, but I think this phenomena of buying citizenship, it's not just Chinese that are doing it. If you go to Europe and Malta, you'll find that a Russian oligarch can buy Maltese citizenship. So many smaller and poorer island nations are essentially finding it useful to sell citizenship. And sometimes it's Chinese, sometimes it's others. I don't think it gets to the stage where they'll take over an island.
You said or predicted that the first Trump administration would be a serious road accident, but not fatal. Are you sure we can recover from a second?
No, and none of us can be sure of that. If Trump returns to power, the effects on American foreign policy would be quite devastating if he follows through on what he suggested. He talked, John Bolton, his former advisor, talks about Trump threatening to withdraw from NATO. That would greatly shake up stability in Europe. Similarly, Trump has withdrawn or did withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords and would probably do so again. That would devastate the efforts to come to terms with global climate change, which is a real problem. So you can see a number of things where Trump would do great damage to American foreign policy. And then there's the damage he would do to our institutions at home, essentially pardoning people uh, who backed him on his lie that the 2020 election had been stolen from him. Uh, I think the damage that Trump would do is quite serious, but I still have the feeling that American institutions probably would survive this. People sometimes say, "Oh, it's like Hitler coming to power in 1933, when Hitler was in fact elected." But if you look at Germany in 1933, the middle class had been destroyed by rampant inflation. And then you had the Great Depression, and the institutions of Weimar Germany were very, very weak. I don't think that's the case in the United States. I just think we'll have a rough decade, but I don't think we're going to see uh, something that's just not recoverable.
Okay, let's move to this concept of soft power, which you're very famous for, which was this idea that you can get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment, correct?
That's right. Yeah. Um, I
This,
I was writing a book in 1989 about the question of American decline. The great British historian Paul Kennedy had written a bestseller called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, in which he said that America was on the same path as Philip II's Spain or Edwardian Britain and so forth. I thought this was wrong. And as I totaled up American uh, military power and economic power, I said there's still something missing, which is the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. And I called that soft
mm,
power. And it was interesting because the Americans had a great deal of soft power. The Soviets had almost none in Europe. As a Norwegian political scientist once put it, you could look at post 1945 Europe as having two empires, Soviet Empire and American Empire. But the big difference was that the American Empire was an empire by invitation.
mm. On the topic of the soft power, I know it really took off and got world attention. It was an attractive proposition, and in fact, the Chinese were interested in the 2000s, but this was after Tiananmen Square. So my question is soft power not just a nice way of putting a spin on something that might be a bit nasty?
Well, power is power, and you can use soft power for bad purposes. As somebody once put it, it's not clear why it's better to twist minds than to twist arms. So power can be used for good or bad purposes. What's interesting about soft power, though, is it depends on the eye of the beholder. To be attractive, you have to be doing things which are attractive to the subject, if you want, of your power efforts, and that gives more a voluntary role to the subject. So, in terms, if you believe that voluntarism or freedom of choice is important value, then you could say that the means of soft power can be better than the means of hard power. Putting it differently, if I want your money and I take out a gun and shoot you, I can seize your purse immediately and have all your money. On the other hand, and that's hard power. If I, on the other hand, want to seize your money, but persuade you that I'm a guru and that you want to give me your money, that's going to take more time, and it's going to take your voluntarism to do it.
You say that Ukraine and Gaza have underlined the importance of hard power, but you say military power is not the whole story, and you say Zelensky's a very good example of that.
Yes, it's a mistake to think that soft power and hard power are polar opposites. There's two sides of the same coin of power. And so sometimes people will say to me, well, given the wars that we're seeing, doesn't this mean it's all hard power and not soft power? You'd be foolish to think that having an army isn't the key when you're involved in a war. But if you ignore the soft power aspects, you're also making a mistake. Zelensky was very good at this in the sense that he realized that putting on a green t-shirt, as a television actor that he was, and appealing to people as the victim of Russian aggression was going to develop sympathy and make him attractive. And he went around the world giving speeches to that effect. And that led people to provide him with military equipment and financial support. So in that sense, he was able to use that soft power to increase his hard power.
Clever, yeah. Okay, let's get, somebody's asking a question here. There's a couple of comments here. Did you ever have any connections with Barry Goldwater? After losing the election to Johnson after retirement from the Senate, he worked with governments to bring amateur radio to soldiers, and his station in Arizona was the go-between for soldiers to talk with their families during the Vietnam War.
No, I unfortunately didn't interact with Barry Goldwater, but a different Arizonan, John McCain, I actually saw a good deal of. And I developed a lot of respect for John McCain, but I didn't know Goldwater.
Okay. What role do you think the different wars the US has been involved in, either directly or indirectly, since the Second World War, is causing the shift in its global standing currently?
Well, I think it's interesting. We tend to go in cycles on this. In the 60s, the Vietnam War became so unpopular that people were marching through the streets to protest American policy. By the late 70s and 80s, America had become attractive again. And after you had the Iraq War, we became extremely unpopular. Then with the election of Obama, you began to see a recovery of American attractiveness. When Trump comes to power and declares America first, which essentially others hear as everybody else second, Americans' attractiveness goes down again. It goes back up somewhat with Biden, though the prospect of a return of Trump makes people overseas a bit uncertain.
Okay, China's coming up a lot in questions. I have a question about China, and then we've got somebody else. This is the question from the audience. Do you agree with the proposition that we're entering a trilateral world, China and India contending for alliances with Russia, African and other nations, the US inward looking and losing international influence, and Europe somewhat a bystander?
Well, that's one scenario. I can paint you other pictures of the future, which I think are more plausible than that one, but that can't be ruled out. For example, if Trump comes to power and decides to pull America out of our alliances that we've created in the period after 1945, that picture becomes more plausible. If, in fact, Biden is reelected, you're likely to have continuation of the same policies, which have reaffirmed American alliances both in Europe and in Asia. And then I think you'll find a continuation of the alliance of convenience between Russia and China, because both of them are worried about the Americans. I don't think it's going to affect the Indians in a trilateral sense. It's interesting, when I go to India, I find the Indians are very afraid of the Chinese. And one of the reasons the Indians haven't criticized Russia more on the issue of the invasion of Ukraine is not because they love the Russians, because they don't want to drive the Russians into China's arms. So the idea of a trilateral relation of India, Russia, and China, I put a low probability on.
You say China won't eclipse America. And you said this is in the article in the Financial Times yesterday, and you said this was for various reasons, and you said 5: our geography and friendly neighbors, our domestic energy supplies, our dollar-based financial system, our demographics, and our technical leadership. So I know you want to expand upon that, but I wondered about this last one, since as far as I can see, China has tied up the electric car and solar panel markets completely because they now dominate the world supplies of lithium and cobalt. So I wondered about that last one, but
Well, if you look at technology overall, the Chinese have made enormous progress. But it's also true that in some of the cutting edge technologies, for example, in biotechnology or information technology, the Americans remain ahead. Take the latest fad, if you want, of generative artificial intelligence. The Americans are well ahead of the Chinese, and it's also going to be difficult for the Chinese to keep up, given their insistence on censorship of the models which are used for training these large language models. And so I think there are many areas of technology where the Americans remain ahead. In addition to that, if you look at research universities, by China's own estimate, in the universities in the world, the Americans are 15 out of 20, the Chinese are none. So I think there is an edge for American technology. The case you cite of electric vehicles is particularly interesting, though, because the extent to which China produces more electric vehicles, which it's now doing, that's very beneficial for the climate. And in that sense, the basic problem of producing car gases, China does more than anybody else, the US right behind them. Between the two of them, the US and China produce about 40% of greenhouse gases. And so the extent to which China invests heavily in solar panels and in electric vehicles, a big blessing. We don't want them to drive our industries out of existence, but we do want them to produce these electric vehicles and solar panels. So devising a policy, whether it's quotas or tariffs or something of that sort, to limit the Chinese on this, but not to stop them, is going to be the hard policy issue.
okay, let's switch to another important area that America's involved in at the moment, which is Gaza. And so far, the US and the UN seem to have proved themselves powerless to rein in Israel's actions in Gaza to create a ceasefire. And you said yesterday in your article on the FT, Israel is hurting its own soft power, and by extension, that's hurting American soft power. Is there any workable solution that you can see?
Well, I think the danger is that has picked a strategy which was not a wise strategy for responding of October 7th. In a sense, you could see or say that Hamas set a trap for Netanyahu and that he fell right into it. And by that, I mean that the success of terrorists is to use the power of the big player against himself, like jujitsu. And by getting the big player to overreact, you can destroy sympathy for the big player. And also, as you kill civilians, you generate the next generation of terrorists.
Mm.
And that's, I think, what's going on now. A better strategy for Israel would have paid more attention to the collateral damage to civilians. And you could imagine a strategy in which you had Israeli incursions in which you would go after specific targets or go after the openings for specific tunnels, but you wouldn't drop 2,000-pound bombs on dense residential areas. So I think the strategy which Netanyahu chose is helping keeping him in power in Israel, at least until the war is over. But I don't think it's the optimal strategy for Israel in the long term. I think it was Lloyd Austin, the American Defense Secretary, who said that you have to be careful that you don't win a tactical battle and lose the strategic war.
Right, right. Someone's asked here, would you comment on the rise of migration on all continents and how it will affect global stability?
Well, I think we're going to see more migration. If you look at what's happening in Africa, you have great damage ecologically. The Sahel region, which is where the savanna and the sand meet, so to speak, is increasingly drying out with climate change. At the same time, you're seeing population growth in Africa higher than any other continent. So basically, there are going to be more and more people who are going to risk their lives to get into Europe on the grounds that if they stay where they are, they're risking their lives as well. And so that problem of how Europe will manage migration from Africa, we've already seen the problem, but I'm afraid that it's going to increase and it's going to be destabilizing. And in the United States, we've also seen a increase in migration as a result of basically difficult circumstances in countries like Venezuela or Honduras. And these put pressure on us. In the long term, what's interesting to notice that the United States is one of the few countries in the world where it's not going to lose its standing in terms of population. Most other rich countries are finding their population is declining, including China, where the labor force peaked in 2015. The US labor force and population is actually increasing. One of the reasons is because of immigration. So if you look back over American history, we've always had an ambivalence about migration. Each generation complains about the next generation. At one time, it was the Anglo types complaining about the Irish. Then it was about the Irish and Germans and complaining about the Jews and Southern Europeans. Then it became complaints about Asians and Latin Americans. But ironically, these various waves of immigration have produced political turmoil in the US, but they've made the American economy and society stronger. So in that sense, I don't think the Americans are facing the same sort of destabilization that the Europeans are facing. Will it destabilize American politics? Absolutely, you already see it. Will it destabilize the American economy and society? I don't think so.
Okay, let's move to an important subject, your alma mater and free speech. You said in the article yesterday, when billionaires try to micromanage the university rather than simply have their names put on buildings, it's a very dangerous path to go down. Would you like to talk a little bit more
Well,
about
that's right. What we've seen in these recent events since the atrocity of October 7th is severe differences about Israel, Hamas, Palestine, and the three Ivy League or two Ivy League and an MIT presidents testifying before Congress were excoriated for not taking stronger stand against anti-Semitism. This basically has created a sense of turmoil in the universities, and it's been generated not just by inside forces, but by outside forces. You have billionaires who are threatening to withdraw their money unless the university made specific changes. And there's press accounts that said that in University of Pennsylvania that donors to the Wharton School said they were going to reduce their gifts by $50 million or something like that unless the president resigned. This is unhealthy. Universities should do their own self-discipline, and having billionaires come in and decide to micromanage it doesn't make things better. They make it worse. In the long run, our interest in universities is to keep dispassionate enough and distant enough from the affairs of the world that we can seek truth on its own terms. That's an ideal. You can never do it. And there are always external forces. But right now, I think the external forces that are dangerous are these outside billionaires. In the 1960s, the external forces were radical groups like Students for Democratic Society and the Weathermen and so forth. So the outside world presses in different ways, but I think today's billionaires who are trying to micromanage the university are an unhealthy pressure.
Okay, we've got an upcoming presidential election in America, which is offering us two likely candidates right now. If either of them win, they will both be the oldest person to ever have been elected to the White House, both Biden or Trump. I just had to take issue with, you wrote a lot about the Trump administration in the book, and you critiqued him very accurately. But there was one comment you made, which I had a bit of problem with. You said, like him or not, he was a brilliant communicator and far more original than any normal politician. Well, that's for sure. I would say that someone who's a pathological liar can't be called a brilliant communicator. He hardly ever held a press conference. And then if he did, he'd throw it into disarray with ridiculing the reporters and throwing people out. So that's my one question about why you think he's a brilliant communicator. And the second is, why are you so against Biden running?
Well, I think with Trump, one has to divorce one's feelings for the character or the nature of the man, where I fully agree with you that he's a pathological liar, and his simple capacity as a communicator. After all, a liar who can get others to believe his lies has a certain skill. It might be reprehensible, but it's a skill. And Trump has proven very successful at that. If you look back over this American century, Franklin Roosevelt was brilliant in capturing the new technology of radio. John F. Kennedy was brilliant at capturing the new technology of television. And Donald Trump has been brilliant at capturing the new technology of social media on the internet. For worse, not for better. But after all, if you look back to Germany and the 1930s, Adolf Hitler is about as reprehensible a psychopath as you could want. And yet you have to admit that in managing television and not television, in film and radio, he was a brilliant communicator. So my comment on Trump is not to exonerate him in any way. It's just to say as a somebody who's looking at technique or skill, we have to admit that he has this skill and we have to fear it.
Mm.
As for Biden, I think Biden would have been better off if he had ended at one term and said, I'm the hero who saved you from Trump. And now let's get a new, younger generation of Democratic politicians to take up the challenge. Um, I fear that because people are wary about his age, because in fact, as people get into their 80s, as I am, your energy levels are not what they once were. I'm afraid that he's not going to be able to do as strong a job against Trump as some of the younger alternatives would have been. So I'm not anti-Biden. I think he's actually done a decent job, but I think he would have been wiser to quit when he was ahead.
A question's come in here. We're running out of time, but I wanted to ask this one. Can you comment on the rise of right-wing parties in Europe?
Well, I think there is a real problem of right-wing parties in Europe. The alternative for AfD has had an effect in German politics. It's interesting in almost all countries, even the Scandinavians like Sweden or the Dutch, you're seeing something in the range of 20% of the populace that are supporting these extreme right parties. And that, to me, is a danger that all modern democracies seem to be facing, which is the rise of right populism in the United States. What's interesting to me is that it doesn't seem to have been a major problem in Australia or New Zealand yet, but it does seem to be something which cuts across modern democracies.
Mm. Well, you've received countless awards throughout your career, but you say the ribbon that you got for growing the best vegetable in a New Hampshire show, I think it was a cauliflower, is one of your
Yes.
favorites. So perhaps it's right in that you do meet this definition. You said one of your friends said that you were cosmopolitan with peasant roots.
That's that's accurate. And it takes us back to your initial set of questions about growing up in a rural area and having to work on the farm. I find if I sit all the time and think about the problems of the world, I can get quite depressed and quite stale. But if I get out into nature and I try to make things grow, and then I see this, some cases you fail, some cases you succeed, but when you succeed in making things grow, it's a great relief from the strains or pressures of politics or world affairs. So I'm very proud of that cauliflower.
That's wonderful. Maybe we should have all the world leaders take up gardening, a little bit of
Could do
contemplative
worse.
gardening
Could
before
do
they go
worse.
to their. Well,
Well,
we did have a lot more questions here. It's hard. I'll do one last one because we're really coming up to the end of the time. What is your view on the position of what America is doing about the Houthis in the Red Sea and Yemen?
well, this is a nasty dilemma because the Houthis quite welcome an American attack because it strengthens their position as defenders of Palestine. And the Houthis are part of a group within Yemen that's in a state of civil war. So it strengthens their positions inside the country, it strengthens their positions in the region. On the other hand, not to respond to the tax on shipping seems to be a big mistake in terms of trying to deter. And the question is, can you attack enough to deter and yet not to fall into their trap? And that's, I think, what the Biden administration has been trying to do, but it ain't easy, as they say.
Hmm. All right, last question. What's your viewpoint on the effect media and social media has on foreign policy perspective?
Well, I think the rise of social media is one of the fascinating changes that I've seen in my lifetime and many others as well. Um, and it means that the political leader has less time to respond. You wind up with tweets expressing policy. I mean, Donald Trump fired some of his cabinet officials by tweet. That's very different world than the 1960s. Take a week or more to figure out how to reply to the Cuban missile crisis. In other words, when the Soviets put missiles in Cuba,
Mhm.
it's very hard to imagine being able to do that today. Uh, so it makes foreign policy more volatile, and it makes the management of crises more difficult. So I think while it may, in some cases, allow you to get your message out, it also constrains your ability to manage the events that are swirling about you.
Yes, the instant aspect of news and decision making based on very little information, just a video, accelerates things, and it deters analysis, really good analysis,
Yep.
because you haven't got the time. Well, I'm afraid our time is up. We've crammed as much as we could, Joseph, from you, and thank you for your wonderful observations and lively history. I suggest anyone who's got the time to pick up your book. It's a good read, very good read.
Well, thank
So,
you, Mary. I've enjoyed the chat.
thank you. Um, Cambridge Forum is made possible through the generosity of Herbert and Dorothy Vetter, the Lowell Institute, Mass Cultural Council, and you. So if you haven't given anything in a while or ever, you can go to the website www.cambridgeforum.org, and you can also sign up there to get our free newsletter. We produce weekly broadcasts of Cambridge Forum for NPR, and a video of today's program will be uploaded after it's edited to YouTube, courtesy of GBH Forum Network, our wonderful partners. And we'll also be posting the podcast of this on our website when it's edited. So tell your friends and revisit and enjoy this and all the other wonderful forums that are posted there. So thank you, Joseph. Thank you to all of you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.